Bob Marley spent his life singing about roots, but the truth about where those roots actually led was something he never knew. When DNA testing was applied to his family line, researchers identified a specific African ethnic group with a precision that surprised even the scientists involved. The result did not simply confirm African ancestry in general terms. It pointed to a particular people, a particular place, and a history that reframes everything Marley stood for. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from, and please subscribe. Bob Marley was born on February 6, 1945, in the small village of 9 Mile in St. Ann Parish, Jamaica. His father, Norval Sinclair Marley, was a white Jamaican of English descent, a plantation overseer's son, who was 60 years old when Bob was born. His mother, Cedella Booker, was a young black Jamaican woman aged 18. The union was uncommon enough to draw attention, and the child it produced belonged fully to neither world. In the tight communities of rural Jamaica, Marley grew up fielding questions he could not answer. Other children called him the Duppy Man, a half-spirit, neither one thing nor the other. His father visited rarely and died when Bob was 10, leaving behind little more than a name and a racial complexity that Jamaican society did not know how to categorize. His mother's community accepted him with reservations. His father's family kept their distance entirely. What emerged from that childhood was not bitterness but a hunger. Marley turned to music and to Rastafari, a spiritual movement that had been building in Jamaica since the 1930s, rooted in the belief that Africa was the true homeland of the black diaspora, and that Ethiopia's emperor Haile Selassie was a messianic figure. For Marley, Rastafari was not simply religion, it was an answer to the question his birth had raised. Africa was where he belonged, even if he had never been there and could not name the specific place. His music carried that longing through every decade of his career. Songs like Redemption Song, Exodus, and Africa Unite were not abstract political statements. They were personal declarations from a man who had spent his entire life trying to locate himself in history. He spoke often of African identity, of return, of reclaiming what had been taken. But the Africa he sang about was largely symbolic, a spiritual homeland rather than a mapped location. The specific people, the specific region, the specific ethnic line that ran through his blood remained unknown. And that gap between the identity Marley built and the ancestry he actually carried is precisely where the DNA results would eventually land with the most force. To understand why Marley's DNA results carry the weight they do, it is necessary to understand what the transatlantic slave trade did to identity itself. Jamaica was not simply a destination for enslaved Africans. It was one of the most brutal processing points in the entire Atlantic system. Between the early 1600s and the formal abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, an estimated 600,000 enslaved Africans were transported to Jamaica. The death toll on the island was so severe that the population could not sustain itself through natural reproduction alone. Slavers had to keep importing people simply to maintain the workforce. That relentless cycle of death and replacement meant that Jamaica absorbed Africans from dozens of ethnic groups across West and Central Africa over the course of 2 centuries. The plantation system did not preserve those identities. It destroyed them. Enslaved people were deliberately separated from others who shared their language and culture, a practice designed to prevent communication, organization, and resistance. African names were stripped away and replaced with English ones. Spiritual practices were suppressed or driven underground. The languages of the Akan, the Igbo, the Yoruba, the Fon, and dozens of other peoples gradually fractured and faded under the weight of forced assimilation and generational trauma. By the time Britain abolished slavery in Jamaica in 1834, the specific ethnic origins of most Jamaican families had been effectively erased. What remained were fragments, a word here, a tradition there, a surname that meant nothing to the person carrying it. The records that survived were plantation ledgers that listed human beings as inventory, noting their approximate origin in the broadest possible terms, if at all. West Africa, Congo, Guinea. Not a people, not a name, not a lineage. This is the historical context that makes genetic genealogy so consequential for descendants of enslaved Africans. Documentary records were never designed to preserve identity. They were designed to manage property. When those records are all that survive, the erasure is nearly total. What DNA can do in some cases is reach past the ledger and recover what the ledger was never meant to hold. For most of the 20th century, tracing the specific African origins of a Caribbean family was considered genealogically impossible. The documentary record ended at the plantation gate. Beyond that point, the trail went cold in ways that no archive could fix. Historians accepted this as a permanent limitation, not a temporary one. The information had not simply gone missing, it had been methodically removed. That assumption began to shift in the early 2000s as commercial DNA testing companies started building reference population databases large enough to distinguish between African ethnic groups rather than simply identifying African ancestry in broad continental terms. The key tool was autosomal DNA testing, which analyzes segments inherited from both parents across all ancestral lines, rather than following a single maternal or paternal thread. When compared against a large enough reference panel of people with known African ethnic backgrounds, autosomal results can identify which populations a person's DNA most closely resembles. The limitation has always been the reference panel itself. African genetic diversity is greater than that of any other continent. Building a database comprehensive enough to reliably distinguish between the hundreds of distinct ethnic groups across West and Central Africa requires enormous sample sizes and decades of collection work. In the early years of commercial testing, those panels were thin. Results for African ancestry were often vague, pointing to broad regional clusters rather than specific peoples. By the time serious attention turned to Marley's family line, the databases had grown substantially. Companies like 23andMe and African Ancestry, the latter founded specifically to serve the African diaspora, had accumulated reference populations large enough to make meaningful distinctions. African Ancestry in particular built its methodology around mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis, tools that trace a single direct maternal or paternal line with high specificity when matched against a well-constructed reference panel. The question was whether those tools, applied to a family whose African origins had been buried under nearly 2 centuries of colonial record keeping, could recover something real. The science was capable in theory. Whether the specific evidence in Marley's case was strong enough to deliver a reliable answer was a different matter entirely. The results, when they came, were more specific than most genetic genealogy findings for Caribbean families tend to be. Testing conducted on Marley's maternal line produced a result that African Ancestry's database could match with a high degree of confidence. His maternal DNA traced back to the Bubi people of Bioko Island, off the coast of what is now Equatorial Guinea in central West Africa. The Bubi were an isolated island population with a distinct genetic profile, which is precisely what made the match so legible to the testing platform. Isolated populations accumulate unique genetic markers over generations, and those markers act as reliable signposts when they appear in diaspora DNA. But the finding did not end there. Broader autosomal analysis pointed strongly toward Akan-speaking peoples of the Gold Coast region, the area corresponding to modern-day Ghana and parts of Ivory Coast and Togo. The Asante, the most prominent of the Akan-speaking groups, emerged as the strongest single population signal in that broader analysis. The Asante were not a minor or peripheral people. They were the architects of one of West Africa's most powerful and sophisticated pre-colonial kingdoms, a society with its own legal system, spiritual framework, military tradition, and diplomatic infrastructure. Their gold wealth had drawn European traders to the coast for centuries before the slave trade reached its peak. For Marley's ancestry, to carry that signal was not a neutral finding. The Asante and other Akan peoples had a documented and disproportionate presence in Jamaica's enslaved population, which meant the genetic match was historically coherent. It did not require an unusual explanation. It fit the known patterns of the trade routes that connected the Gold Coast to the Caribbean. What it did require was a reckoning. Marley had built an identity around African roots without knowing which roots they were. The DNA now pointed to specific soil, a specific people, a specific history. The symbolic Africa of his music was being replaced by something more precise, more particular, and in many ways more remarkable. The question that followed was not whether the result was accurate, it was what that result actually meant. The Asante did not simply appear in Jamaica. They were brought there through one of the most heavily trafficked corridors of the entire Atlantic slave trade. The Gold Coast, the stretch of coastline corresponding to modern Ghana, was among the earliest and most consistently exploited regions in West Africa for the purpose of enslaved labor. Portuguese traders established contact in the 15th century. By the 17th century, the British Royal African Company had made the Gold Coast a primary source of supply for its Caribbean operations. Jamaica, as Britain's most profitable Caribbean colony, received a significant portion of that human cargo. Akan-speaking peoples, including the Asante and their linguistic relatives, were transported across the Atlantic in number large enough to leave a visible cultural imprint on Jamaica that persists to this day. The word Obia, still used in Jamaican spiritual practice, derives from Akan roots. The term Duppy, the word Marley himself was called as a child, has linguistic connections to Akan-speaking traditions. The cultural residue of that forced migration did not disappear entirely. It embedded itself in language, in ritual, in the way communities organized themselves under conditions of extreme oppression. There is a further layer. Akan-speaking people were disproportionately represented among those who escaped slavery in Jamaica and established independent communities in the island's mountainous interior. The Jamaican Maroons, who fought 2 formal wars against British colonial forces and eventually negotiated a treaty guaranteeing their autonomy in 1739, included a significant number of Akan-descended people. Their resistance was not incidental. It drew on specific cultural traditions of warfare and spiritual practice that Akan communities had developed over centuries on the African continent. Whether Marley's specific ancestors were among those who resisted in the mountains or among those who endured on the plantations cannot be determined from the DNA alone. The genetic result identifies origin, not experience. It names a people but cannot narrate their particular story within the machinery of slavery. What it does confirm is that the line connecting Marley to the Asante and Akan world is not symbolic. It is biological, historical, and older than Jamaica itself. The DNA result did not only reach backward into Africa, it also confirmed what was already visible on the surface of Marley's biography, but rarely examined with any historical seriousness. Norval Marley, Bob's father, carried English ancestry that the testing confirmed with clarity. That line traced to the English settler families who had been present in Jamaica since the 17th century, the same class of people who had administered, profited from, and depended upon the plantation economy that enslaved Marley's maternal ancestors. The genetic record, in that sense, held both sides of the transaction in a single person. Norval himself was a complicated figure by any measure. He was 60 years old when Bob was born, married to another woman at the time, and largely absent from his son's life. He acknowledged Bob as his son and arranged for him to attend school in Kingston for a period, but the relationship was thin and ended early. When Norval died in 1955, Bob was 10 years old and had spent very little time with him. The English line in Marley's DNA is not a sentimental inheritance. It is a historical one. What makes the European result significant is not its presence, which was expected given Norval's background, but what it represents in the context of Jamaican history. English ancestry in a Jamaican family of Marley's generation almost always traces back to the colonial apparatus: plantation managers, overseers, merchants, administrators. Marley carried that architecture in his genome alongside the ancestry of the people that system had enslaved. That is not a contradiction unique to Marley. It is the genetic signature of the Caribbean itself, where centuries of forced contact between enslaved Africans and European colonizers produced a population whose DNA is, almost without exception, a record of colonial violence as much as of human survival. Marley understood this in the broad terms his history allowed. He sang about Babylon, about systems of oppression, about the weight of inherited suffering. What he could not have known was that the very genome he carried was a precise biological map of the history he was describing. The question that follows confirmation is rarely simple. Knowing where someone came from does not automatically explain who they became, but it does change the frame through which their life can be understood. Marley's Rastafarian identity was built around Africa as a spiritual and ancestral homeland. That identity was not vague or decorative. It was the organizing principle of his worldview, his music, and his public life. Rastafari directed its reverence toward Ethiopia, toward Haile Selassie, and toward the idea of Zion as a place of return. The movement's African focus was real and deeply felt, but it was also broadly construed. It pointed toward a continent, not a coordinate. What the DNA introduced was specificity, where there had been spiritual generality. The Asante were not Ethiopians. They were West Africans, from a kingdom that had its own distinct religion, its own royal traditions, and its own relationship with land and power that had nothing to do with the Ethiopian imperial framework Rastafari venerated. The genetic result did not invalidate Marley's spiritual identity, but it did place that identity alongside a biological one that pointed somewhere different. This is not an unusual condition. Many descendants of enslaved Africans who built identities around Pan-African or diasporic frameworks are now discovering through DNA testing that their specific origins differ from the cultural affiliations they were raised within or chose as adults. The framework was built in the absence of information. The DNA provides information the framework was never designed to accommodate. For Marley specifically, the Asante connection carries a particular resonance. The Asante resisted European colonization longer and more effectively than almost any other West African people. They fought the British Empire directly in a series of wars stretching from the 1820s through 1900, when the British finally exiled the Asante king and absorbed the territory into the Gold Coast colony. That history of organized, sustained resistance against the same colonial power that had enslaved Marley's ancestors and shaped his father's lineage is not incidental. It suggests that the defiance running through Marley's music may have had deeper roots than even he was aware of. The DNA result answered a question Marley never had the tools to ask. It gave a name to the ancestry he carried, located it on a map, and connected it to a history specific enough to stand alongside everything else known about his life. But the science also drew a boundary, and that boundary is worth examining with the same seriousness as the finding itself. Genetic ancestry testing identifies population clusters based on statistical similarity to reference groups. It does not decode experience, belief, or meaning. Marley's Asante and Akan genetic signal tells researchers which population his ancestors most closely resembled. It does not tell them what language his great-great-grandmother spoke in the last weeks before she was taken. It does not record what she believed would happen after death, what she called her God, or what she sang to her children. Those things were not stored in her cells. They were stored in her community, and that community was destroyed. This is the limit the science cannot cross, and it is an important limit to name clearly, not to diminish what the DNA revealed, but to understand it accurately. The genetic result is real and significant. It is also partial. It names a people without narrating their lives. It confirms an origin without recovering the journey. What it does do, in the context of Marley's life, is close a particular loop. A man who built his entire identity around the question of where he came from now has a partial answer grounded in biology rather than faith. The Africa he sang toward was not a fiction. It was a real place with real people whose history of resistance, survival, and cultural sophistication predated European contact by centuries. Marley spent his life insisting that roots mattered, that the severing of people from their origins was among the gravest injuries history had inflicted. The DNA confirms that the roots he was pointing toward were real. It also confirms that the full depth of those roots, everything that was lost in the passage from the Gold Coast to the Caribbean, remains beyond the reach of any test. Bob Marley's DNA confirmed the specific African origin his music had always pointed toward without ever being able to name. The Asante connection gave his lifelong search a biological foundation it had never possessed. But the science stopped where the history went silent. It could identify the people. It could not recover the individual lives lost in the passage between continents. What the test ultimately revealed was not just ancestry, it was the precise boundary between what survival preserved and what the slave trade permanently erased.